Hello, I am Patrick Barini, and I am here to present HTML and CSS. And throughout this PowerPoint, we will explain and explore the different concepts and ideas that HTML and CSS present. So let's get started. We're going to break this down into two sections so that's a little bit easier to take it in chunks. Alright, the first question that I always want to look at is what is HTML? HTML is a coding editor that they use to basically build up websites. And normally, this is just a worldwide use of this. This is kind of a web standard, and it has made applications for websites much faster and easier. As you see on this slide, excuse me, there is the bits and pieces of the actual HTML code. The first one is HTML. That's basically the whole everything of HTML. It's the web page basically. So it's just top of it and all that, and that's where all the bits and pieces are all like together. It's a whole sandwich basically. HTML is basically a sandwich when it comes to code. And then next you would have a head. The head is basically like the information, the metadata that's actually involved with the HTML. And then you come to the title, which explains the actual concept of this actual the actual explanation of what this is. Like you could put it in as like an assignment or final project that what we would do for ours. So then you get to the body. The body usually contains a paragraph, an anchor, a line break, content headings, images, like it's a variety of stuff. The body is usually the main source of everything. You can also normally above the body is going to be usually for like CSS products. We will get into like CSS code. Usually it's just a little more organized. That's just how I personally do it. It just keeps things more organized. But let's look at some of the attributes of HTML and then we can move on further from that. The attributes allow for different values, and the general form is more widely used, while the element form is not as widely used. One is simpler than the other, but it is a lot easier to use the general form from what I have researched. So I would recommend if you are trying these, like definitely be sure to try the general form first, but it's okay to try both. Always good to experiment with things. So this is an example of the actual layout of it, and so let's go through it a little bit. So the doc type HTML is always on top. It's always the header. It's always the beginning of everything. Then usually we have, as I said, HTML. It's a sandwich. That usually signifies the language. What are we using? So like if we were using like let's say Spanish, you'd obviously have a different abbreviation there, and that's usually normal for like anyone who else is going to use it. So code is just differently based on like region and language and all that. But yeah, then you come to the head, which is going to have the metadata, as I said. It's usually unchanged. You really don't have to worry about that. Then you get to the title, and that's usually going to be something specific of what you choose. And that's usually squished into the head, while the body is also separate from the head. And that's usually going to be your paragraph, your index, your anchor, your images, all those other parts and pieces I said. So that is very important to know that. But they all come under the HTML sandwich, the two slices of bread, which is HTML. So that's basically how you structure your whole code with everything. It's pretty simple, but it can get a little tricky when you first start out. So let's go over some history of HTML. HTML all started back in 1990. It was basically just a structural text document for like simplistic pieces. It wasn't anything too crazy. Like it was just simple. It was just a structural form basically. Well, then in 1993 we got HTML3, which also added tables, which was kind of like a convenience to be able to like add charts and tables and all that to this actual like data thing. So that when you have the website, it looks more appropriate and official. And we all know in the 90s, like websites weren't as what they look like today. 30 years later, um, they were a little more like chaotic, a little more like kind of like scuffed, but like obviously you have to start somewhere. And then in 1994, HTML2 was released, which was kind of an improvement on the actual HTML3. But in this sense, most HTML and CSS will always improve on the previous one in subs, basically, in like little like chunks. In 1995, HTML was approved under the W3C, which we will go over in like a little bit, and it basically allowed for a new standard of website building, and also it brought images, which is really cool because you didn't really get that. Um, then in May of 1995, you got HTML 3.2 was published. Basically, as I said, a chunk of HTML 3, which basically probably helped add new features and new elements to the actual HTML 3, which was already previously being used from 1993. So about 3 years later, it was just improved. And in January 1997, HTML finally got introduced with some type of design, font, and size, which is called CSS, which we're going to currently go over right now. So CSS is the design part of HTML. It basically adds color, size, font, and layout to the actual website. So if you want to add like a nice image but put like a border around it, or you want to add shapes, or you want to add like colors or stuff like that, like it gives the site life compared to like it just being like simple text like HTML. So CSS is cascading style sheet basically. So it's very simple, and it also, as HTML does, it has different types of levels that each of these also help to function and benefit the actual HTML. So let's continue on by giving a little history of CSS. So CSS basically it started out from Hookah Woon Lee, who basically worked with Tim Berners-Lee, who developed HTML, to create this kind of like design software for HTML. Then in 1996, like a year before it was with HTML, it was invented, and then it got introduced a year later into HTML. So then, as we went along in 1998, CSS2 was released, and it worked on CSS3 in the beginning, basically. So like they basically worked hand in hand together, and it really helped them. And it's kind of interesting to know that like CSS didn't really update a lot on itself from CSS2 for almost like over like is it 20 years? Probably no, like at least almost like 10 years, 10, 15 years, it didn't update itself to like 2.1, which released a few errors. So like that means it was a pretty good one. Like that's a good chunk of time. And it's really good that like it was able to work with different things, and also help with different routes through CGML and XML, which are two different forms similar to HTML. So that's really interesting to look at and think about all this stuff, about how this all came to be. Well, there's interesting parts about CSS. There's three different types, but each of these have their own different type of personality. So normally for CSS, the coding is a little bit different. Inline is a pretty basic one. It's pretty basic. It's like it allows for a specific style, which is a property, and then you have a value. So like a number, or like let's say the color red or something like that. And then on what content you're using it for, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's not really anything that's like different from what we actually know. Then you have internal CSS, which takes on the HTML style, but is much simpler and much more straightforward than normal inline CSS. So I do recommend doing that one. That's just my personal opinion with it. It's a lot easier apparently, and it's a lot simpler to like just know how everything is set up. I just think it's breaking it up is a little bit easier. Then we have external CSS, which has two parts. You have the link element, which basically is mainly for images. We personally used it in my class. It was pretty nice and efficient. It was very nice to have and be able to use. And then we also had we didn't do the file format one, but it is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's very similar to inline, but it's pretty straightforward for link element. That's just the one I prefer to use. Excuse me. And it's a little more simplistic when it comes to that stuff. So let's look at an example at it. This is basically another example. As I said, it still takes a sandwich form. You can once this is like normally like you wouldn't have to worry about how this is all placed normally because they're using the inline. I mean, excuse me, they're using internal CSS on this example. So the style here you have XYZ is the color is like the color name, and then you have color and that. So this is like this is like like whatever it is considered color and then blue and then like the whole page would be blue, but in the paragraph if you have specific kind of like ideas like of what you want paragraph font and style to be, it'll like you can go like into depth with that, but you also have to make sure that it is always in like when it comes to this part where it says ID equals um, what's it called? Excuse me, brackets, quotation mark XYZ, quotation marks. You have to make sure that like it's always inside the first paragraph part, because then it won't work. It's just how it's always been programmed to be. So if you're ever trying this, please like be aware of that. And it's very simple, and it's a very simple mistake that can happen. But I assume that it won't be that hard for anyone to figure out right away. All right. So next, after we learned about CSS, I want to talk about W 3C. W3C is very important to know because it has to do with the World Wide Web, and we'll see in a minute why like it has to do with the World Wide Web. But it's basically the worldwide consortium, basically a group of people that basically look over the internet, check for mistakes, maintain it. If there's an HTML error, they can help out with that. But most companies do their own HTML work. So it's just to keep a standard throughout the actual internet so that everything is kind of uniform, but like diverse in its own way. Like there's a standard. It's like in normal society. Like you wear a t-shirt and pants all the time. Like and once in a while you see someone with a skirt, or you see someone with like shorts on. Like it just not everyone's the same, but we're still wearing similar, like we're still wearing clothing and all that, but like it's just a different style. Anyway, it's good to kind of look over a brief history of W3C. W3C is originally based from the World Wide Web, which was created by Tim Berners-Lee, who basically created the whole World Wide Web, and he also helped create the World Wide Web consortium. So like he basically created most of the World Wide Web. This was kind of news to me when I first started this class. I did not know who invented the internet. I felt so. I mean, I did not know who invented the World Wide Web, and I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy. But once you kind of learn about it, it's kind of interesting that like it was all just coined back in the 90s, and it all just kind of came to be like it's almost there been 30 years since the internet, like since the World Wide Web has been around. Like it's insane to think about how something so small has been around for like almost 30 years, like, and we take for granted every day. It's crazy. But I do want to say that like it's interesting that this is their timeline from when they first started, from like the beginning of the idea, the coin idea, when like the internet first started way back in the 50s, and just to see like it being like kind of like structured back in the 70s, and then like 80s like it just kind of like had a foundation, and the 90s is really where it all started, because it's when the development process happened, where we had the technology for it all and how we had everything to go with. And what's really interesting is that me being born in 1998, I didn't really know much about the internet, and I really have only been around enough for the internet to be like kind of like always there for me. So like I took it for granted. But it's so interesting to see that like how long the internet's been around for. It's been around for like years, for almost a century, and it's crazy to me to think about that. So like, hey, don't take your stuff for granted. That's just one of these tips on this video. But anyway, one of the things I do want to mention is if you are interested in coding with HTML and CSS to build websites and all that, these are some softwares. I have three recommendations: GitHub, Visual Studio Code, and Atom. I've used GitHub and Visual Studio Code for the class I'm currently presenting this for, but I do recommend trying out Atom, I use that for visual novel building. It is really interesting. It takes on the same form. It's just a little bit different of a coding system, but definitely check it out. I promise it will definitely be beneficial for you. And on the other side, definitely check out these resources. If you can't get like stuff online, it's always good to check out books, or if you can't find stuff that are like physical books, it's always good to check online. HTML, CSS design books and websites by John Decken. I have that. Definitely recommend that. It's a very good resource. And what's it called? W3 Schools is also very good, so I definitely recommend checking that out. It's one of my top 10. So if you're interested, check those out. Just look at the website, click on the links if that benefits you guys. But I want to end out with my citations. These are all the information where I got all the information from, where I kept everything organized to make sure that I knew what I was doing and that it was all accurate. So I want to say thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope this is able to help you and have a great day. Bye bye.